Before this video begins, remember to like, subscribe, and leave a comment down below. Sarah had just moved into her new apartment complex and was excited to start her life in her new home. However, her excitement was short-lived as she met her next-door neighbor, Mrs. Johnson. Mrs. Johnson was an elderly woman who had lived in the complex for over 20 years. Sarah quickly learned that Mrs. Johnson was notorious for being a difficult neighbor, always complaining about the noise levels and other minor disturbances. Sarah did her best to keep quiet, but she quickly realized that it didn't matter how quiet she was, Mrs. Johnson would still find something to complain about. One day, Sarah was working from home, typing away on her computer when she heard a knock at her door. She got up to answer it, expecting to see a delivery person or a friend. Instead, she was met with Mrs. Johnson, who had a scowl on her face. "Hello, Mrs. Johnson," Sarah said, trying to be polite. "I need to talk to you about the noise," Mrs. Johnson said, her voice sharp. Sarah was taken aback. She hadn't been making any noise, so she didn't understand what Mrs. Johnson was talking about. "What noise?" Sarah asked. "The noise coming from your apartment," Mrs. Johnson replied. "It's been going on for hours. I can't take it anymore." Sarah was confused. She hadn't been making any noise, so she didn't know what Mrs. Johnson was talking about. However, she didn't want to upset her neighbor, so she apologized and promised to keep it down. The next day, Sarah was sitting in her living room, reading a book, when she heard a knock at her door again. This time, she was met with 2 police officers. "Ma'am, we received a noise complaint from your neighbor," one of the officers said. "Can you keep it down?" Sarah was shocked. She had been reading quietly, and there was no way she was making enough noise to warrant a complaint. She explained this to the officers, but they insisted that she keep it down. This pattern continued for weeks. Mrs. Johnson would complain about noise, and Sarah would do her best to keep quiet. However, it seemed like no matter how quiet she was, Mrs. Johnson would still find something to complain about. She would knock on Sarah's door at all hours of the day and night, demanding that she be quiet. Sarah was getting tired of it, but she didn't know what to do. One day, Sarah decided to confront Mrs. Johnson about her behavior. She knocked on her door, and Mrs. Johnson answered. "Mrs. Johnson, I need to talk to you," Sarah said, her voice steady. "What is it?" Mrs. Johnson asked, her tone hostile. "I understand that you're having trouble with the noise, but I've been doing my best to keep it down," Sarah said. "However, it seems like no matter what I do, you're still finding something to complain about. I don't know what else I can do to make you happy." Mrs. Johnson scoffed. "You can start by not making any noise," she said. "I'm entitled to a peaceful living environment, and you're disrupting that." Sarah was getting frustrated. She had been doing her best to be a good neighbor, but it seemed like Mrs. Johnson was impossible to please. "I understand that, Mrs. Johnson, but I don't know what else I can do," Sarah said. "I think we need to come up with a compromise that works for both of us." Mrs. Johnson rolled her eyes. "Fine," she said, "but you need to be quiet or I'll call the police again." Sarah sighed. She knew that she wasn't getting anywhere with Mrs. Johnson, but she also didn't want to escalate the situation any further. She decided to reach out to the apartment complex's management to see if they could mediate the situation. After explaining the situation to the management, they suggested that Sarah and Mrs. Johnson attend a meeting to try and come up with a compromise. Sarah was hesitant, but she agreed. At the meeting, Sarah and Mrs. Johnson sat down with the complex's management and tried to come up with a compromise. Sarah suggested that she could wear noise-canceling headphones while working, and Mrs. Johnson could give her specific times that she needed quiet. Mrs. Johnson reluctantly agreed, and they both signed a document outlining the compromise. For a while, things seemed to improve. Sarah did her best to keep quiet during the designated times, and Mrs. Johnson didn't complain as much. However, it wasn't long before Mrs. Johnson was back to her old ways. She would knock on Sarah's door at all hours of the day and night, demanding that she be quiet, even outside of the designated quiet hours. Sarah was at her wits' end. She didn't know what else to do. She had tried to be a good neighbor and come up with a compromise, but it seemed like nothing was working. She even considered moving out of the complex, but she didn't want to let Mrs. Johnson win. One day, Sarah was talking to another neighbor, who had also had run-ins with Mrs. Johnson. The neighbor suggested that they start a petition to get Mrs. Johnson evicted from the complex. Sarah was hesitant at first, but she eventually agreed. They gathered signatures from other neighbors who had had trouble with Mrs. Johnson and presented the petition to the complex's management. After reviewing the petition and hearing from multiple tenants, the the management decided to terminate Mrs. Johnson's lease. Sarah was relieved. She could finally live in peace without having to worry about Mrs. Johnson's constant complaints. However, she couldn't help but feel sorry for Mrs. Johnson. She knew that the woman was just lonely. Hey and wanted guys, this someone is to talk Storyscape, to, and thanks for watching. But her behavior had made it impossible for anyone to befriend her. In the end, Sarah learned that sometimes, no matter how hard you try, you can't please everyone. Some people will always find something to complain about, and it's up to you to decide how to handle the situation. She also learned that sometimes the best solution is to walk away and find a new environment that is more conducive to your peace of mind. Hey guys, this is Storyscape, and thanks for watching.